Hello, anatomy students. Today we're going to talk about hypothalamic control of the pituitary gland. Here's what you need to know, and at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you a brief quiz, so keep your heads up. Number 1, identify two general functions of the hypothalamus. Number 2, contrast the structures of the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. Number 3, detail how the structure of the pituitary gland affects communication with the hypothalamus and facilitates its function. And number 4, describe the role of negative feedback loops in hypothalamic control of the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is an endocrine organ. It is going to synthesize hormones that are going to control the anterior pituitary gland. These hormones are called inhibiting and releasing hormones. The posterior pituitary gland secretes hormones that are synthesized by the hypothalamus itself. So the inhibiting and releasing hormones from the hypothalamus are not released in a constant stream. Instead, they are released in pulses. And it's the frequencies of these pulses that stimulates various groups of cells in the anterior pituitary gland to respond to those hormones. So as you can see on this graph, I've got one releasing hormone pulse per hour, and hormone A at that frequency is released at a high level, while hormone B is released at a low level. If we decrease that frequency, the amount of hormone A goes down, but the amount of hormone B goes up. And when we return back to the original frequency, there goes hormone A up, 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 and hormone B goes down. So it depends upon the frequency of the pulses. Hormone A in this example is actually LH, which is called luteinizing hormone, and hormone B is FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. And the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is called GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone. So when the hypothalamus releases GnRH at a pulse rate of 1 per hour, you're going to have higher concentrations of luteinizing hormone and lower concentrations of FSH. And when that frequency decreases, you're going to have lower amounts of LH and higher amounts of FSH. These two hormones are going to cause the growth of a follicle during the female sex cycle. And as that follicle grows, grows, and grows, it's going to release more and more estrogen. And the more estrogen that is released by the follicle, that's going to feed back to the hypothalamus, and it's going to communicate to it how large that follicle is. And then the hypothalamus can adjust the frequency of the pulses in order to secrete more LH or to secrete more FSH. And so it's this negative feedback that is going to allow the hypothalamus to gauge its secretions. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are very close in proximity. And so here on our slide, you can see that I've got the hypothalamus here at the top, and the purple square is showing us the pituitary gland itself. Now over to the left of your screen, you have the anterior pituitary, and to the right, the right of your screen is the anterior and the left is the posterior pituitary. And then it's connected physically to the hypothalamus by a strip of tissue that's called the infundibulum, or the pituitary stalk. I also wanted to make mention of the optic chiasma, because the optic chiasma, which is where the optic nerve, that one comes from each eye, that's where they cross in the brain. And that's always on the anterior aspect of the face. So if you find the optic chiasma, right below it, you always have the anterior pituitary gland, because they're both on the same side of the head. The anterior pituitary gland has a different origin from the posterior pituitary gland. Even though they're fused together and they're considered one gland, they do come from different places in a growing embryo. And so as we can see here, the anterior pituitary gland is formed by an invagination of epithelial tissue that's coming up from the roof of the mouth, which is also known as the pharynx. This is called the adenohypophysis, and this just means that it's a gland. It's connected to the hypothalamus via the hypophyseal portal system, which basically means that we've got two capillary beds, one in the hypothalamus and one in the anterior pituitary gland, that are connected to each other through portal veins. The neural hypophysis is deriving from actual brain tissue. So that's going to be a down pocketing of nervous tissue. And then these two are going to merge together in order to form, let me get myself out of the way, in order to form what we know as the pituitary gland itself. So the posterior pituitary gland is made up of the same tissue as the hypothalamus. All right, so as I mentioned, the hypothalamus is connected to the anterior pituitary gland via the hypophyseal portal system. So if you look here, we've got hypothalamic neurons that are kind of looped around and surrounded by capillaries, which are called primary capillaries. And then these capillaries narrow to form portal veins, and they expand to form a second capillary bed called secondary capillaries. So these are called portal veins because, like regular veins in the body, they always take blood directly back to the heart. These are called portal veins because they're not going back to the heart. They're connecting one capillary bed with a secondary capillary bed. And so that's why they're called portal veins. So they have a little bit of a different function. So here's what happens. Our hypothalamic neurons up here are going to synthesize their little pink hormones. Those hormones are going to travel down the axon and into the primary capillaries. They are going to travel through the infundibulum, through the portal veins, and then into the secondary capillaries found in the anterior pituitary. There they diffuse out of the secondary capillaries and bind to their target cells. Their target cells of the anterior pituitary gland are going to synthesize their hormones. See how that changed over to the blue square triangles. And then those hormones enter into the capillary bed and they leave through the general circulation and they get pumped throughout the body by the cardiovascular system. The importance of this is that the hormones that reach the anterior pituitary gland are undiluted by the blood. So the anterior pituitary gland is always getting a full strength signal. So the hypothalamus can stimulate and inhibit the anterior pituitary, and I've got to move my face over here again. Okay, so releasing hormones that come from the hypothalamus will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. And so the releasing hormone comes down through the portal veins into the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases some anterior pituitary hormone. There's 7 that you need to know. And those are going to go into general blood circulation and reach their target tissues. Inhibiting hormones are going to prevent the anterior pituitary from releasing its hormones. So an inhibiting hormone comes down through those portal veins and into the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary hormones are inhibited, and that's what those 2 blue bars mean right here, that we've got inhibition happening, and that's going to prevent the target tissues from being stimulated anymore. This is going to all occur because of negative feedback. So let's revisit this once again. Hypothalamic releasing hormone enters the anterior pituitary, which secretes hormone 1. That's an anterior pituitary hormone. And APH1 is going to stimulate an endocrine organ or gland somewhere in the body to secrete its hormone, which I'm calling here hormone number 2. Now, it's the presence of hormone 1 and 2 that's found in the blood that is going to feed back to the hypothalamus and stop the hypothalamus from secreting its releasing hormone. That is negative feedback. And I wish that it was as easy as that, but there's one other step. It's kind of as easy as driving your car. So from the last slide, remember that it is blood hormone levels that will help to communicate to the hypothalamus what kind of hormone to secrete, a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone. I want you to kind of think about what you have to do in order to stop your car at a stoplight. you actually have to perform two actions to get one result. You have to take your foot off the gas pedal and you have to press down on the brake pedal. So that's two actions. The result is your car stops at the stoplight. I want you to think about your gas pedal as representing releasing hormones. Your brake pedal is representing inhibiting hormones. So gas pedal releasing, inhibiting brake pedal. So let's take a look at this picture that I've got. So releasing hormone comes from the hypothalamus. It travels down to the anterior pituitary, which releases its hormone. Anterior pituitary hormone 1 goes into the general bloodstream, and it causes another organ or gland to release its hormone, which we're calling hormone number 2. Hormone number 1 and 2 together inside of the blood are going to stop the hypothalamus from secreting releasing hormone. But it's going to do something else too. Those two hormones are going to stimulate the hypothalamus to secrete inhibiting hormone. So we have two actions with one result. The result will be to stop the anterior pituitary gland from secreting hormone 1. So once again, remember our gas pedals. So the stopping of the releasing hormone is like taking your foot off the gas. Stimulating the release of inhibiting hormone is like pressing down on the brake. Those two actions create one result. It's going to stop releasing hormone from coming down through the infundibulum into the anterior pituitary gland, thereby stopping the release of anterior pituitary hormones, and thereby stopping stimulation of the endocrine hormone and the release of hormone 2. Two actions, one result. One question that one could ask then is the posterior pituitary gland really a gland? Many people would say no. Not because it's nervous tissue, but because it doesn't synthesize the hormones that it secretes. It's just releasing hormones that are created by the hypothalamus. So if you take a look at our diagram, there are two areas in the hypothalamus that are synthesizing the hormones that the posterior pituitary gland releases. The first area is called the supraoptic nucleus, which is a group of neurons that is above the optic chiasm. So this nucleus is producing a hormone called ADH, antidiuretic hormone. The paraventricular nucleus is synthesizing oxytocin, which is the hormone that stimulates contraction of the uterus during childbirth. So what happens is that these neurons create the hormones, see the yellow circles, and then those hormones are going to travel down the axons of these neurons and diffuse into the capillaries that are found inside of the posterior pituitary gland. And then they enter general circulation and go to the body in order to stimulate their target tissues. I want you to notice that the posterior pituitary gland just has capillary beds that are going to perfuse it and bring in oxygenated blood and take away deoxygenated blood. I have no portal veins here in the posterior pituitary gland at all because it doesn't work with a portal system. Those hormones are coming directly down the axon and into the capillaries that feed into the posterior pituitary gland. Oxygenated blood is entering the posterior pituitary gland through the inferior hypophyseal artery, and then deoxygenated blood that's laden with hormones are leaving through the hypophyseal veins. And those are going to take blood away from both the posterior pituitary gland and also from the anterior pituitary gland. All of that blood laden with hormones is going to enter into the general circulation and it's pumped through the body by the cardiovascular system. All right, let's see how well you were paying attention. How does the hypothalamus control the actions of the anterior pituitary? Through regulatory hormones, both inhibiting and releasing. And number 2, which part of the pituitary contains axons of hypothalamic neurons? The posterior. Thanks a lot, everyone. I appreciate you watching. Bye-bye.